Okay, here we are in week 7, and we're going to be talking about issues in policing. Specifically, we're going to talk about changes to law enforcement as a profession over time. We're going to talk about the unique culture in policing, different styles. Really, that's more different personality traits of officers. We're going to talk about different issues that influence police discretion. We will talk about racial profiling as well as the consequences of continued exposure to stress and fatigue. And then we'll talk about some of the more hot button issues related to brutality and corruption, deadly and non deadly force. And then we'll close out this chapter with a look at some of the less than lethal um weapon systems that are currently employed. Over the past several weeks, we've highlighted on the fact that law enforcement has changed over time, mostly because of cultural expectations, mostly because of Supreme Court decisions. The cop way of explaining this is to simply state that bad cops make bad case law, and um, you can apply that same sentiment to the entire profession that when things go bad, change is required. And in large part, many of the changes that we've seen over the last 20 years at least have been related to the bad decisions of officers that have trickled throughout the country. Some of the factors that are good, though, relate to education. For as an example, law enforcement agencies now are leaning more towards the concept of post secondary education requirements before they ever hire a new officer. 32% of agencies now require some type of a degree. 23% of those are, asking for at least an associate's degree. And while only 2% require a bachelor's degree, most agencies prefer or even incentivize um, officers going to go get an associate's or a bachelor's degree. In Kansas, we currently only require a high school diploma or a GED. However, research does show that those brand new officers who go to the academy who are college graduates fare much better academically than high school graduates do. Another change is that we're beginning to see more minorities enter the law enforcement field. We're still a field that is predominantly staffed by white males. However, that trend is changing over time. And as you're researching or reading in your text, make sure you take a look at Table 7.1 that breaks out um, some of the most current demographics available within large agencies. We began in the 80s to see more females serving um, in law enforcement agencies, and the largest trend is within large agencies. Small agencies typically have had a female officer of some kind for quite some time, and I don't know why it's more prevalent in rural agencies than it is larger ones, but that seems to be the case. Research shows us that women are successful in this profession, even though gender bias within the ranks still remains a problem today. As we talk about the culture of the profession, there's some sentiments that are good and some sentiments that were intended to be good that ultimately end up as a negative thing. And one of the concepts relates to what's been referred to as the blue curtain. And you'll hear things like blue curtain, blue flu, thin blue line, etc. And they all center around the thin blue line mentality, which is that there remains a constant need to separate uh, good from evil. And the concept of the thin blue line is that those officers who constantly serve on a regular basis are that barrier between good and evil. The problem is, and it's why you see it displayed on most flags, is that on either side of that thin blue line is the color black, black representing sin, black representing evil, etc. Meaning that just because we're protecting one person today does not mean that we're not taking action against them in the future because they were the ones who ended up doing the wrong, meaning you don't know necessarily where that evil is going to come from. Anyhow, as it relates to what our text describes as the blue curtain, is the fact that officers tend to socialize together or they have a desire to associate with relatable people, even if it's not other cops. Sometimes it's other first responders that they associate with. And mostly it's because they've shared similar experiences that the rest of the general public simply doesn't understand. Over time, that can develop into that thin blue line or that us versus them mentality, which puts officers in a position to consider the rest of society as bad or backwards, and only those who have served as being worthy of their time and association. And that's a dangerous path to go down, because over time it can really isolate an officer socially and put them in a position where the alarm bells for leaders related to a problem officer might tend to go off. That's difficult. I think every single one of us in uniform have experienced that in our career, or are experiencing that in our careers. And the truth of the matter is that it is difficult to relate with the general public your experiences, because they've not shared them. And it's a different conversation to talk about a traumatic incident with another cop or another EMT or even a firefighter than it is with someone who's never been around it. We're no longer shocked by certain things that we see or experience that the general public most likely would be. That tends to create an insulated lifestyle outside of work. It gets exhausting constantly working within the public eye. And so when you don't have to wear that uniform and you can disconnect away from it, you tend to withdraw and stay away from um, the public. Other people may choose to get off work on a weekend and go to a concert or to a ball game or to a county fair, etc. Oftentimes, first responders will choose to simply stay home to avoid those crowds, because they're going to go back to work on Monday or whatever their shift calls for and be right back in the mix. Mostly, this is influenced by an officer's personality. Um, First responders' personalities have a tendency to change the longer that they're in the job, depending upon their work assignments and depending on several other factors. But you can kind of classify in broad terms, or even stereotype in broad terms, different policing styles based on personalities. Some of them that exist out there is the crime fighter, the guy or gal whose focus is victim driven, and they see themselves as a protector. Or you have those that are social agents that see themselves as community problem solvers that want to reach out and look at fixing things in the long term. You have the by the book type officers who um, do their best not to consider any outside factors, but simply what does the law say and what took place. And then finally, you have the watchman or that passive officer who really only steps in when they have to, but they're focused on keeping the peace. Those personalities have the ability to impact discretion. Discretion is, in some circles, a bad word. In most cases, it's a troublesome word. But the fact of the matter is, we rely heavily on officers to make the best decision possible within the scenario that's been presented to them. That is never an easy challenge, because we're looking at what we can see. We typically don't have a back history of what's occurred or any other relevant foundational information that can help us make that decision. It's based on what we see within the moment. But the things that influence discretion on the fly, beyond personality and stress levels, is what level of offense are we dealing with? Are we talking about a felony here, or are we talking about someone who's rolled through a stop sign? That from one spectrum to the other is going to influence the decision. Victims, or more specifically, the relationship between a victim and a suspect, impact officers' decisions related to discretion. And in many cases, that's why states have worked to remove discretion. For example, that domestic violence victim that just flat will not leave her spouse, no matter how many times the police are called, begins to wear on officers. Were it not for the fact that the law requires agencies to respond to those calls and requires them to make an arrest, in many cases, officers may grow tired of dealing with the same problem and choose not to act. Living where you work also impacts decision making, and small town officers can attest to this. Most small agencies still require their officers to live in the jurisdiction within they work, and so it can influence decision making if the action you're about to take against someone is someone that you're very familiar with on or off duty, or that your family is familiar with on or off duty. The department itself, its general practice, its influence from leaders and peers will impact how an officer makes decisions. If the rest of the group only writes a ticket if someone's driving 8 miles an hour over the speed limit, you're more likely to fall in line and follow the same practice. Suspect behavior is always an influence on discretion, and is pretty well self-explanatory. If a guy's a jerk, he's probably going to get it. But if he's acting somewhat repentant or sorrowful for what's occurred, the officer may decide to give someone a break. Ultimately, it comes down to the officer themselves. They're going to be impacted by their past experiences, their career goals and where they want to go, and their individual personality are probably the greatest factors related to police discretion. Let's talk about racial profiling. So, profiling is simply a term that describes what influences police discretion. Um, Investigators, when accusations of racial profiling are made, will consider a disproportionate citizen contact for the agency as well as for individual officers. In other words, an accusation's been made that say a cop is racist or a cop only took action because of the person's race that they were dealing with. An examination of their full work effort usually takes place. Does this officer write more tickets to blacks than he does to whites? Does he write more tickets to males than he does to females? And they become an indicative of a pattern type problem. In many cases, complaints come as a one-off, as a one-time incident, and it does very little to examine whether that officer is working in a biased manner or not. We have to consider the full scope of what they're doing. This is a topic that's hyper criticized, not only by law enforcement, but by the public as well as the media, and it's not fully understood the impact that it has. We recognize that biases exist, no matter how much we want to eliminate them from our decision making process. It's more about now the trend is recognizing the existence of the bias in order to mitigate any natural gut decision and cause an officer to reevaluate what they're doing. Most states, including Kansas, require bias based police training on an annual basis, meaning officers have to sit down every year and take training on bias based policing. And there are also formal complaint processes that are put in place in just about every state. Kansas is one of those. As a member of the CPOST Commission, I can tell you that bias based policing complaints are automatically sent to the Law Enforcement Commission and automatically investigated every time that they come. Stress and fatigue seem inherent with a first response role, whether you're firefighter, EMT, law enforcement officer, etc. Just about every type of public service agency is understaffed, but the demands for the job have not declined in any way, shape, or form. This leads to both excessive stress and fatigue. Stress is seen through difficulties with relationships outside of work, and the inability to disconnect from your home life and pay attention to what's going on the street. Repeated exposure to traumatic incidents. It's important to remember that first responders are exposed to 300% more traumatic incidents than the average person is because it's their job to go to those things. They're going to see them on a regular basis. The job of a law enforcement officer is certainly dangerous. I mean, the fact of the matter is no officer goes to work every day and can state with any kind of certainty that they will 100% come back home that night. That's just the acceptance of the role when you walk in the door. Brand new officers may have been told that, may repeat that themselves, but until they experience that and then experience it over and over again, they don't really recognize fully what's being stated there. Combating stress requires support, peer support, family support, professional support, and it also requires stress reduction techniques such as exercise, such as meditation, such as mental health treatment, etc. Otherwise, officers have a tendency to fall into those things that they work on a regular basis to combat, such as substance abuse or the creation of a broken family, which only makes the problem worse. Fatigue is caused by simply extended working hours. It is not uncommon for an officer in a small agency to work between 65 and 80 hours a week. It's not uncommon for officers who've been assigned to work a 10 or a 12-hour shift to be held over to make sure that there's adequate coverage. 18-hour days are not uncommon, and when someone's working that long and that hard and working in a life and death decision-making environment, an error is going to be made at some point. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Mitigating the effects of fatigue has been a focus for law enforcement leaders and researchers for a long period of time. Other issues related to police, policing in general, that are most notable or get the most attention. One of them is police brutality. Our book defines it as actions that, such as using abusive language, making threats, or using force or coercion when unneeded, prodding people with nightsticks. Nobody carries nightsticks anymore, but you get the point. And stopping and searching people simply to harass them is one or several examples of brutality. Most agencies now have detailed policies on when and how force can be used, and it can have an effect on mitigating police brutality. One of the biggest tools ever implemented to help eliminate this kind of activity among officers are body worn cameras and strong policies that require them to have them on at all times. Not only has that reduced the incidence of brutality, but it has reduced the number of complaints that agencies receive as well. Police corruption is defined as exercising legitimate discretion for improper reasons or using illegal means to achieve approved goals. So, this can be unlawful searches, this can be gaining a search warrant for your own endeavors. Marion, Kansas is a pretty good example of this. The chief of police was hyper criticized for his past history as a Kansas City, Kansas police captain, and as retribution for it, sought and gained a search warrant to the newspaper that wrote that article and went and seized those things. That case is still ongoing. You'll still see it pop up in the news media from time to time, but it's going to cost that city and that chief of police a lot of money. Is one good example of it. Agencies like CPOST investigate claims of corruption and have the ability to take certification and action um, if it's warranted or if the complaint of corruption is founded. Um, and these will range from internal corruption for promotional hiring practices, etc., selective enforcement based on who's done what for whom, or even actively breaking the law, to include bribes and extortion. Hey, I won't do this if you pay me this, or I will look the other way if this occurs, but you've got to take care of me first. Probably the most dramatic and traumatic things that law enforcement has to address with related to their issues and ethical issues is the use of force. Deadly force is the use most normally of a firearm, but can be another instrument, resulting in the high probability of death. Putting that into plain language, no officer pulls their firearm from their holster without recognizing the fact they're probably going to kill someone. A handgun is not the only tool that can be considered a deadly force instrument. Vehicles within a pursuit can be. If a maneuver is used to terminate that pursuit, there's a high probability that person's going to die when that occurs. Non deadly force considers most of the same tools except for firearms, but that doesn't mean that it's not dangerous. The more appropriate term um, is less than lethal in order to more accurately describe what we're intending to do. In other words, I may pull a taser and point it at a suspect or even deploy it at a suspect. I have no intention of harming or of killing that person, but the danger exists in the right circumstances that may very well happen. Probably the most critical Supreme Court case that impacts the use of force for law enforcement officers has to be Tennessee versus Garner in 1985. It took the furthest steps to require states to redefine their statutes of when officers can and cannot use deadly force. It is still levied today. It is still considered a landmark ruling, even though there are more current cases related to the use of force. Tennessee v. Garner is really the case that started that momentum forward. As we're talking about less than lethal weapons, some of the more notable ones that are employed by law enforcement officers today are, of course, the taser. Um, there are also tools such as impact weapons, and what I mean by that are simply beanbag rounds or rubber pellets that can be deployed, especially in crowds. Chemical agents, though not as widely used because of the taser, are still available today. Those are your pepper or OC sprays, etc. Some agencies still carry batons, and one of the newest things out, and I'm sorry I didn't have a picture to put on the slide for you, is what's known as a BOLA wrap system that allows us to incapacitate someone from movement from a distance. In other words, we keep officers out of danger by deploying that BOLA wrap and allow them to take someone into custody without further injuring themselves. That is a very quick look at what is a little bit of a longer chapter. And though, and because this is an introductory course, it does not dive fully into so many of those issues. Chapter 7 highlights just about every topic that every law enforcement leader um, has to deal with on a regular basis, especially with any agency of any size. The bulk of their policies are centered around preventing so many of these topics from becoming a problem for their agency. And so much of our continuing education on a daily basis, or on a yearly basis, is designed to prevent any of those issues from happening now. And so while it's at a high level, I'd encourage you to take note of the fact that there's so much of that impacts an officer, even when they first walked into the door for the job having the best of intentions. They simply get worn down by what they're faced with on a daily basis over time. Don't forget to check your attendance. Please make sure you read the entire chapter, and I look forward to seeing your discussion posts.